The market demand curve in competitive industries is downward sloping, but the demand curve for any price-taking firm in a competitive industry is perfectly horizontal at the price that's set in the marketplace. In other words, a competitive price-taking firm can sell as much as it wants to at the price that's set in the market equilibrium. For a price-taking firm, the marginal revenue of producing one more unit of the output is therefore always equal to the market price. But when a firm has a monopoly, the market demand curve is its demand curve. It therefore faces a downward sloping demand curve, and every time it chooses to produce an additional output unit, it'll have to lower the price at which it sells that unit. Thus, the marginal revenue for a monopolist is not flat the way it is for a price-taking firm. We can illustrate this with a linear downward sloping demand curve. The demand curve depicted here is a demand curve we've previously seen in Chapter 18 when we developed the concept of price elasticities. There we found that the price elasticity of demand is equal to -1 at the midpoint of a linear demand curve. Above that, the price elasticity lies below -1, and we'll say that we find ourselves on the elastic portion of demand. And below the midpoint, the price elasticity lies between -1 and 0, and we say that we find ourselves on the inelastic portion of demand. As we approach the horizontal axis on the demand curve, the price elasticity converges to 0, and as we approach the vertical axis along the demand curve, the price elasticity converges to -infinity. If your recollection of price elasticities along linear demand curves is rusty, go ahead and review graph 18.3. We can now develop the concept of marginal revenue for such a linear demand curve, assuming that a single firm faces this demand curve. The marginal revenue curve will have the same vertical intercept as the demand curve, but intersect the horizontal axis at half the distance. In other words, it has the same vertical intercept, but twice the slope of the demand curve. It should make intuitive sense that the marginal revenue curve begins where the demand curve begins on the vertical axis. The marginal revenue of the first unit that's produced is the price at which we can sell that first unit if that's all we produce, and that price is right off the demand curve. Next, let's think about what marginal revenue is when the output level is around 200. If the monopolist is producing 199 units of output, the demand curve tells us that those units can be sold if they're priced at $300.50. Were the monopolist to increase her output to 201 units, she'd have to drop the price to $299.50 in order to sell the 201 units of output. She would therefore experience an increase in revenue of $599 for the 2 additional units she's producing when she's producing 201 rather than 199 units. But at the same time, she'll lose $1 for each of the 199 units she previously produced because she has to drop the price by $1 when production goes from 199 to 201. By producing 2 additional units, she therefore gains $599 but loses $199 for a net increase in revenues of $400. When total revenue increases by $400 by producing 2 additional units of output, the marginal revenue of 1 additional output is about $200, which is precisely what's indicated by the marginal revenue curve at the output level of 200. It should also make sense that the marginal revenue curve must intersect the horizontal axis at half the distance of the demand curve, in our case at the output level of 400. At this output level, we've reached the midpoint of the demand curve, and at that midpoint, the price elasticity is equal to -1. In Chapter 18, we found that when consumers find themselves on the price inelastic portion of demand, a drop in price will cause consumer spending to decrease. Thus, as we enter the inelastic portion of demand, below the midpoint of the demand curve, if the firm lowers its price, consumer spending on the goods the firm produces will fall, which is the same as saying that total revenues for the firm will fall. Thus, as we increase output level on the inelastic portion of the demand curve, total revenues for the firm will fall, which means marginal revenue is negative. And we enter the inelastic portion of the demand curve as we cross the midpoint of the demand curve. Thus, that midpoint is the dividing line between where marginal revenue is positive on the elastic portion of the demand curve and becomes negative on the inelastic portion of the demand curve, reaching 0 right at the midpoint.